Today, I'm speaking with Oksana Semenik, art historian and journalist from Ukraine. She has created a really engaging Twitter account called Ukrainian Art History, and I'll put a link to that in the description of this video. It focuses on topics that include decolonizing American and European museums, and in particular, Ukrainian art and artists that have been labeled as Russian for more than a century. Oksana, welcome to the channel.
Hi, thank you.
Well, let's start with, we're going to talk about art history. We're going to talk about imperialism, obviously. We're going to talk about some individual artists, and I'm going to try and upgrade my editing skills by putting some of the images into the video as well. But I think we have to open with the war, because I know you've been in the US doing research, which we'll come on to in a minute. But actually, at the start of the war, you were in Ukraine, and you were actually in Bucha, which is a name that's going to be familiar, I think, to everyone who watches this channel.
Yeah, thank you for your introduction. And, actually, this is important to talk about this connection between decolonization of the museums that Ukrainian art historians are doing right now. And of course, about the war, because actually I believe that this war, it's not just about the territories or, I don't know, resources. It's also a cultural war. Russians, they're trying to destroy our culture, and they're trying to destroy our language and our people. They were doing it actually by centuries already. Why we are talking right now about decolonization and about art history? Because that started a long time ago. Talking about my experience, when the full-scale invasion started, because actually war in Ukraine started, as you know, in 2014 by annexation of Crimea and in Donbas region. I was in Bucha, and we were living in the basement with my husband and my cat and other 30 people for 2 weeks. And we managed to escape by foot. So we were walking from Bucha to Kiev. When some journalists or people asking like, oh, where this idea of the Twitter account came from, sometimes I'm joking that actually everything began in Bucha when I was laying just down without any power, electricity, heat, water and food, and I had plenty of time to think about some things. And I was thinking about Ukrainian art history, actually, because, when in dark times like that, you should believe in something. And of course, I was believing in Ukrainian armed forces and in our victory. But the other thing was my dreaming about how Ukrainian art history will change. And I was like, oh my God, if I will survive there, I would turn back all these artists that Russia stole centuries ago, like Malevich, Alexandra Ekster, Abram Manevich, and a lot of other actually artists. And the thing is that it's not just like 5 artists or 10. Sometimes it's like 80 Ukrainian artists considered as Russian ones, as in Zimmerli Museum in New Jersey, where I was doing my research about that.
And that's what fascinates me about this, because, take it as a given that Russian museums will label Ukrainian artists as Russian, and we'll come to the imperialist attitude of that, not just in Soviet times, because again, one of the things we're trying to do in this channel is to dispel the idea that the Soviet Union was a brotherhood of nations, that somehow it was an idealistic project. No, it was an imperial project, and there's no question of that. So it's taken as a given that in Russian museums that labeling is not going to be correct. But I think your point in the channel is that the world of academia across the world has taken its cue from Moscow. And in fact, many Western collections essentially have inadvertently or unconsciously propagandized the art history of Ukraine.
Yeah, actually, well, probably I should start from how this collection of Ukrainian artists, how they came to the world famous museums as MoMA or MAT, or I don't know, even Zimmerli. So sometimes it's for example, story of the Zimmerli collection is really interesting because that was like one guy, collectioner, Norton Dodge, and he was even attending Soviet Union for like couple of times before he was forbidden to do that by Soviet government. And he was collecting a lot of art from the Soviet republics, like Ukraine or Russia or Estonia or Latvia, etc. And he has this idea that he should save this art because it probably would be destroyed. So it's the collection of the Zimmerli Museum. It's not like propaganda art, but it's more non-conformist art, abstractionism, I don't know, conceptualism, and so on. But probably he met some of Ukrainian artists in Moscow or in St. Petersburg, because there where the money was, right? It was a metropole. So it was like the main country where resources were everything, you know. So of course, probably he bought these works, and you know, who will ask some artist from where he was, right? It was like Soviet Union, one Soviet person, one Soviet citizen. So so it was labeled as Russian. And as I said, more than actually 70 Ukrainian artists were mislabeled, and 80 of artists from other, you know, Soviet republics, which is now independent countries. But also before me, other Ukrainian curator, Olena Martinyuk, did big work as well with most famous and well-known Ukrainian artists that she knew that they are not Russian, you know, because my research was actually sometimes really hard, because I was looking not in some catalogs or books or whatever. It was sometimes like family archives, family trees, you know, with brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, and etc. So this is what happens. And actually, I believe that it doesn't matter how they became Russian, like Russian in the museums, why they're labeled like this. Because if we know now that this artist is Ukrainian, why we shouldn't change that? And it was actually my argument when I was writing to MoMA, actually yesterday, that this is actually a mistake on the website when you have information about, for example, Ilya Kabakov And in the MoMA website, he labeled as not as just Russian, but born in Russia. But he was born in Dnipro, which is Ukrainian city it's in the central part of Ukraine. So how does it work? It's just a mistake. It's like write about him, not Ilya Kabakov, but like Ivan Kabakov. This is mistake. It's not just question about his nationality, his beliefs, or
It's
something
just
like that.
factually wrong, isn't it? It's just
Yeah,
incorrect. And it's been difficult, I think, for people to understand the sort of dissonance or understand, the sensitivities of it until recently, until the war, and it's become very sort of visceral for everybody. But to translate that into other imperial terms, it would be like an Australian artist being labeled as an English artist, or a Scottish artist being labeled as an English artist. People can feel how offensive that is because it's close to their own world. It's no different in this case here either.
That's how I'm actually explaining this to American museums. For example, even in their own collections, they have like Indian objects, art objects, or artists that were born in India during when it was like British Empire, right? But they are not right in India, then British Empire, or United States, then British Empire. And we can talk about that a lot, but they're
Or even
using
the
this.
US itself, labeling
Sure,
an American
sure.
artist as a British one because
Yeah,
we happen to, own them for a couple of decades. It's ludicrous.
yeah. And this is the thing that I I I see this problem just with Ukrainian artists who were born during the Russian Empire. And I don't know why. What's the problem? Are they so scared of Russia? Are they do not believe that we're different people? Or I mean, sometimes I can understand why some academy why some people do not understand that colony can be not overseas, but to the next to your neighbor actually. But
There's a good
yeah,
example,
but I
isn't
think
there?
still,
I mean, not last year, the year before. I was in Paris, and I kind of kicking myself because I didn't have time to go and see it. But there was a major retrospective. I think the first time there's been such a huge exhibition with all his works gathered in one place. But Ilya Repin, who is often labeled as probably one of the most famous Russian painters, and it came as a revelation to me that he's actually Ukrainian and his surname is Russified, almost certainly to sort of fit in when he moved, obviously to work in the imperial territory. I didn't go and see his works in Paris, which is unfortunate because, the chances of going to Moscow or St. Petersburg now to see them where they typically hang is next to zero. I doubt whether I'll be allowed into Russia again. But he's an extraordinary artist, and yet, consistently he's known as a Russian artist, not a Ukrainian one. And yet, when people check out your Twitter profile, you've got some fantastic images of Repin's, countryside images, which we'll show here in a second. And they're extraordinary, and they're quite unlike any of his large, painted works that would be done under commission. And they display, well, I'll let you're the expert on the art. I'll let you sort of describe it. But there's an absolutely beautiful kind of landscape picture, which is quite unlike anything else I've seen there. It's absolutely, hauntingly beautiful.
yeah, actually, Repin is one of my favorite artists as well. And you mentioned the Russified surname. And I just wanted to add about Ivazovsky, because that's what's happened to him. Because Ivan Ivazovsky, he was actually from Armenian family, and his truly surname is Ivazyan, which is, more Armenian surname. But also I can't say that we should see him as Russian artist at all, because I'm not sure, but I think that he was in Russia just like visiting someone, maybe teach for a couple of months or a year. He was living in Crimea, in Feodosia, all his life. And even when the war started in Crimea with it was Russian Empire versus Ottoman Empire, he evacuated to Kharkiv, where Repin was born, in that region. And maybe they were so connected with each other because, some of the artists who were studying with Repin, they were studying also with Vazovski as students, as their students. So we have a lot of connections between everyone, between even Vazovski and Repin and Malevich. I believe we can create all this. We can create all these connections. So about Repin and about this work, which is, it's, we should say that Ilya Repin was born in Chuhuiv, it's Kharkiv region. It was actually occupied, and I'm not sure if the museum is still in a good condition there, because it was occupied by Russians the last year, but now it's liberated, which is good. So he actually, of course, started his studying in the academy in St. Petersburg. But we should understand as art historians why a lot of Ukrainian artists started to their studies in this academy, because that was the metropolis. And what metropolis does to colonized countries, it forbid the education, higher education, academies, language, all the resources, creating big museums, and etc., etc. So if you want to be a good, like famous artist, what you had to do? Of course, you should move to St. Petersburg and start at the academy. And actually, it's very funny that in St. Petersburg, you could, every nationality could enter the university, such academy as, art, and is art academy, but only Russian artists would leave the academy, because for example, there is one artist, Ivan Pokhidonov, he's Ukrainian artist from Odessa, and he was studying just 1 year in that academy, and some Russian art historians naming him as a Russian artist because he was just studying there for 1 year. And it's like crazy because he never had any other connections to the Russia except for like visiting or whatever. So yeah, actually, and Repin, he was connected to Ukrainian culture. He knew Ukrainian, and his kids were speaking Ukrainian as well. And actually, his son was killed by Soviet government in 1935. And he moved to Finland, actually, because he didn't want to be with the Soviet government and with Russian imperialism. I mean, I can't say...
Yeah. I mean, for those who don't know, he, back in the early days of the revolution in the 1910s, he produced some beautiful paintings based on street protests, incredible sea of red flags and so on. So it's not that he was one of these sort of conservative figures who was against reform. He was very much a sort of liberal social reformer. But as you say, he had to flee, and he was on Finnish territory, because I've actually gone to see his museum. And it's very ironic to an extent, because the Studio Museum is beautifully presented, and it's got a lot of photos, and it's been kept very much as it was when he died. But of course, that is Russian territory now, because Russia invaded Finland. And in terms of the peace deal, they stole a huge chunk of Finland's territory.
Yeah,
But in the period where Repin was there, it was part of the Karelia Peninsula.
that's true. That I worked actually answered yesterday Brooklyn Museum, which, I was writing them about this work that you mentioned. So I'll tell a little bit more about Repin's connection to Ukraine. For example, he travels a lot. He traveled a lot through Ukraine, especially in Kharkiv region, for his painting. And in his famous painting, Not Expected, you can see actually Taras Shevchenko, which is, one of the most famous Ukrainian poet and painter, very revolutionary, and on the wall. And he actually made sketches for the future monuments of the poet, one of the first ones. So, and even he was not rich, which is interesting. He was so famous, and he's so famous right now. Repin was not rich at all, but he helped a lot to the Union of Fine Arts in Mykolaiv, and was respected member of the Kiev Literary and Artistic Union and the Kiev Antiques and Art Union. So he was participating in Ukrainian life, in Ukrainian cultural life, actually. And so the story about that painting in Brooklyn Museum, it's called Russian Landscape, which is of course not true, because, and even museum mentioned that on their website, that it was made in Chuguyev, so in Repin's hometown, but they call it Russian Landscape. And even if we didn't know where this painting was made, you can see that it's typical Ukrainian landscape, because even the houses, Ukrainian houses, they're different from the Russian ones, because Russian houses, they're wooden, they're made from the wood. Ukrainian one, they made differently.
So they got sort of thatch. I think the key difference, isn't it? They're like the outside wall will be sort of brick or mortar of some sort, probably a mixture of brick and maybe wood and brick combined. And then the roofs are a kind of thatch, a kind of loose fitting sort of made out of plant material. And actually, they're very, very similar to some of the dwellings you'll see in images of Scotland and Ireland of the same period. So in Scotland, they're called blacking houses. Again, very closely built together. So quite a sort of strong communal thing, with the houses built closely together into a village type pattern. You get the same in Ireland. They obviously look quite sort of run down, but actually this picture makes them look quite neat, doesn't it? They're off in the way in the corner of the image. They look pretty neat, although they're not the significant part of the image. But they exude a kind of strength, because you've got what is a rolling landscape, but the trees are like huddled in the little gorge. The trees look kind of quite twisted and naked in the landscape. And then you've got the houses, and it suggests that, humans are minimal in the corner of the landscape, but actually it fits very, very naturally, and you get this sense of sort of strength and it being very natural, and an idea of being hardy as well. Whereas if anyone who's seen a Russian village layout, they have a different kind of layout, different materials. Often they're built along a straight line, along a road, not in the sort of based around a sort of farm pattern that you see in that picture. So completely different from any Russian landscape.
Yeah, that's true. But as Ukrainian, you also recognize this landscape if you if you have ever been in the Kharkiv region, because this is actually a road to Donbas region, to Luhansk Oblast. So it's very typical when the forests, they, you know, it's almost a steppe. And this is just, you know, typical Ukrainian. So, you know it, but by houses,
Yeah.
also by meals. And, you know, I looked closer and I saw that he wrote Chuguyev actually by himself in the down, you know, in the picture. Yeah, and still they want to say that this is a Russian landscape, like maybe you should just learn geography. And I wrote them to the Brooklyn Museum and sent other 12 artists who were considered as Russian and labeled as Russians, but they are not. And they never responded about anything about Repin's work. And they said yesterday that it still will be Chuguyev, then Russian Empire, or like former Russian Empire, which is really offensive because I found other artists in their collection, for example, from Estonia, when Estonia was part of the Russian Empire, and it was just Estonia. The other thing that, as I told you, was with the Indian art objects, the same. And but also, what is interesting about Ukrainian artists in the collections, that Ukrainian artists who were born in the part of Ukraine that was part of Austro-Hungary, they're just born in Ukraine. So this Russian mislabeling happens just to the artists who were born or who lived in the part of Ukraine that was, you know, Russian Empire. But they're not even mentioning the Russian Empire. They're just saying Russia. So it's even more offensive. For example, in Smithsonian Museum, they have Kharkiv, Russia, Odessa, Russia, Kiev, Russia, as it's like right now. And during the war, while these cities, they're you know, it's shellings almost every day. The cities are being destroyed, and some people in the museums believe that it's okay to say that Kiev is Russia or Odessa is Russia, and they do not understand that this is actually a part of Russian propaganda to say that. And I mean, imagine a person who knows nothing about Ukrainian art or Ukrainian culture. For example, it's just like some art historian from New York or London, or even some, I don't know, long distance countries from Ukraine. I don't know, that they do not know any context. They probably know that there is some Russia, but they never heard about Soviet Union or Russian Empire or whatever. And so they're looking at this collection and they're imagine that Russian culture is actually great and amazing because, oh my God, look, they have more than 300 artists in MoMA. It's actually true. You can check that if you will open their website and try to search the collection, and you will write Russian or Russia, it will show like more than 300 artists, which is at least 80 of them are not, because I did that research as well, online research. And now I have communication with MoMA as well.
I mean, this would be offensive enough in peacetime, wouldn't it? But in the context of a genocidal war, when Russia is consciously bombing museums, is consciously shooting musicians, artists, authors in the way they did in the 1930s. They have a strategic aim to destroy the intelligentsia, to destroy the artistic and classes that help define and build Ukrainian nationhood. And I think we need to be really unambiguous about that. This isn't accidental. It's a feature, not a bug, of their war. And it makes it, in wartime, especially offensive that collections would not reconsider these inherited imperialistic and Soviet imperialistic values.
Yeah, that's true. And the thing is that I believe that Russia stole all these artists, and international museums still helping to keep this stolen artists for Russia. They're like supporting it because they help them to imagine if it will be if it would be alive people, artists, and they're like holding them as a hostages, right? And saying, oh no, they're Russian. No, it's our people. I feel that this is the same. It's like turning back, like the soldiers turning back our territories and liberating them. The same is very important to liberate our and decolonize our culture from the Russian context. And of course, it's offensive even during the peaceful times, but it was never a peaceful times because they started doing that in the Russian Empire like 300s or 400 ago, right? And they killed a lot of artists during Soviet times. They destroyed huge amount of Ukrainian art, such as Bolshevikists, for example. Very amazing art school that was popular in Paris, actually. They have their own schools in Paris, and nothing. We just have like couple of these works because the other artists were hiding them and risking their lives to hide this art. Also, that happened to Ukrainian, the art of Ukrainian 60s, when a lot of people were killed by KGB or sent to gulags, or as Alla Horska, for example, she was killed and her father-in-law in their house in the village because she was not actually like supporting Ukrainian independence. She was just calling for justice to artists, to people actually, and she was just killed because of her work. And I can name, the poet Vasil Stus, who died in the Gulag, and it's a lot of other names.
And it's not just the 1930s, is it? Because people might think,
Sure,
oh, Gulag, 1930s, 1940s. We're talking
yeah,
about
but
poets, writers, artists dying in the 1960s, the
yeah,
1970s, even
this like
as late as the
Alla,
early
yeah,
80s.
Alla Horska and Vasil Stus. This is like examples, but also but yeah, and they're and now they're doing this. For example, what about Lyubov Panchenko? That she was in her 80s when she was trapped in Bucha because she was living there and she was alone. And she actually died because of starvation during she died like a couple of days after liberation of Bucha. But it's a horrible story. She didn't deserve to die like that. And she was amazing artist. And even if we're talking about these artists who labeled as Russian in collections, for example, Malevich, his Ukrainian artist who considered himself as Ukrainian, And we know it because of the archives of KGB, because, well, he was the only one artist who were creating works about Holodomor, the genocide of Ukrainians, where the Stalins, Stalin, he gave this order to take food from the people, and especially from people in the villages, because people in the villages, they were more independent, because they didn't want to go to these collective farms. They have their own land, and they also have all these traditions. So, I mean, you should understand that Ukrainian village, it's a very rich place where Ukrainian art was created. I mean, almost every person knew how to draw, how to make some embroidery, and so on. For example, today is the birthday of Maria Primachenko, and she's great. One of the most, I think, popular Ukrainian artists in Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And she was self-taught. So because she was living in a village, and that's how people, lived in Ukrainian village. It was very rich before Holodomor, after which millions of Ukrainians died. And this is what I'm trying to do in my Ukrainian art history account, to talk about these connections between social political life and between art, because Soviet art history was teaching that there is no connection, and it will be funny, right? Remembering all the propaganda, but their art history was like, this is art, this is politic, and so you should not criticize the life, you should not talk about the real life, only it's propaganda about the party, communism, and etc., or something just like flowers, folk art, and etc.
Yeah,
So
it's neutering. It's taking the
yeah,
power to innovate away from the medium, isn't it? And I remember seeing that when I was in Russia, because I'm very interested in folk music and dancing and so on. And it seemed to me that the variations of these on offer in Russia were so formalized, were so limited, in that, only a strict interpretation of the costume, the moves, the music was allowed, and no innovation seemed to be possible, that, these restrictions actually kill the art form. They turn them into almost like a fake or a pantomime or a mockery of an art form, and they suck all the life out of it.
yeah,
Same with art, I guess, as well.
yeah, that's true. And that's why it's so important to me, and that's how I see my work, and how I want to talk about art history, with the connection of these social political events. Because I don't remember who, but I think French journalist asked me if I'm choosing the art and artist who has this cruel and sad stories, who were repressed or killed by KGB or by Russians or whatever. But
No, they all were.
not. It's I mean, then I do not choose artists because of their stories of repression, starvation, appropriation, or hard life during immigration or war. But then when I'm preparing this stories, some facts in the artist's biography disturb me. For example, story of Hanna Sobachko-Shostak, who was a Ukrainian artist of decorative painting from the village. And under the influence of modernists, such as Alexandra Ekster, her style moved from traditional folk painting to decorative graphics. And she moved to Moscow region in 1930s, when Holodomor started. And I've begun searching their archives and found that that she was actually saved by an artist from Kiev, Yevgenia Pribilska, and that she wanted to save this talented artist and her family from death. So he managed to take Sobachko to Moscow region. And that's how begins her exile, because she never turned to Ukraine. It was forbidden for her. And it's like I'm just choosing the really great and interesting art, and then I've seen the stories because something disturbs me. Or for example, when one of my first stories on this channel was about Fedor Krzyzewski, who was a successful modernist artist and whose works were actually presented at Venice Biennale and some museums worldwide. But anyone in the Soviet Union who did not agree to work in social realism style and praised the Communist Party in their work was repressed. And he died in Irpinki region in 1946 because of starvation. And because actually one of the reasons was that he stayed during the occupation in Kiev, during the Nazi occupation. And, Stalin and Communist Party believes that everyone who did not evacuate was, betrayals of the nation or something like that, they called it.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just a horrible stories. And I'm not choosing them specifically because of it.
And my last question is going to be around the other thing that's left out. If we return to that painting, the famous one by Repin, of what we think is probably a political prisoner returning home, and it's labeled, he was unexpected. And for those who haven't seen it, we'll put an image up, but it's a very gaunt and haggard man, quite young, but he's clearly aged significantly more than his years. And he's returning to what looks to be a simple but quite nice and neat house. And the family are kind of shocked, surprised, hugely emotional to see him back. And of course, there's one layer of interpretation that, that is a critique of political oppression. That's a critique of exiling people to Siberia and Tsarist repression. And that's quite a nice story. But then when you mention that there's the picture of Taras Shevchenko on the wall, that adds a whole completely other level of story, interpretation, nuance to the image. So these museums that are incorrectly labeling it, they're not just doing a disservice to the artists and the Ukrainian, origins, cultural origins or inspiration of those pictures. They're actually stripping away an entire layer of narrative that could enrich those pieces of art.
Actually, there's so many examples that I can give you that that I can give you that it's really hard to choose something. Because, for example, that was interesting how I started my research in Zimmerli. It's actually started because of one work. So one of my researches in Ukrainian art history is Chernobyl catastrophe and its image in Ukrainian art. And so I was doing this research in the Zimmerli collection, and then I found this work that was really interesting for me because it was made in 1986. So it's the year when Chernobyl disaster happened. But it said that the artist was Russian. But what was strange for me is this Ukrainian, is this thing made of straw? I mean, you can, I hope you
Google
can
an image. Yeah, we'll find an image of it and we'll
sure.
post it on the video.
I have it. And so it's a very typical Ukrainian thing. And I was it was really strange for me why Russian artist would add that to its work because it's Ukrainian. They do not do that. It's like with the Taras Shevchenko portrait or this Ukrainian houses that are not wooden, so you know it because of your cultural I don't know, experience and these feelings that it's our thing. It's like with dancers of Degas, actually. And this is the other important thing that I don't know if you ever heard the story about dancers, Degas dancers, and they were called Russian dancers, but they actually have all these dresses like Ukrainian ones. And the National Gallery in London changed the name. And now it's Ukrainian dancers because they're in national dresses. But the Met did not change that. And I still have communication with them. So
and does that make it easier when one museum makes the decision to make a change? And clearly this is evidential. You know, they've looked at the national costume, they've compared it, I guess, to photographic or written records, and they're able to say, no, this is definitely, you know, cannot be matched to any Russian national costume. It's cut and dry when the research is done. Does it make your task easier when you can quote, you know, museums like the National Gallery, or not so much?
They still did not respond to me, so maybe after they will. I can tell you this, but I'm not sure because it's such a mess even in their collections. For example, when they're saying, for example, like there's two artists who were born in Ukraine, and one of them they considered as Ukrainian, and the other one is still Russian. And you're saying like, hey, look at this. It's even in your collection. You have this mistake, but you did not change that. And I don't know actually why. Why? Maybe they're not see Ukrainians as people with, I don't know, education, or they not believe us. So, for example, why
administrative sort of just laziness? Goodness, who knows why?
Yeah, but also about so I was doing this research in one museum, and they asked me about some archives that can that they can see that this artist was born like in Kiev or in some other city, or some proofs that he's actually Ukrainian. And this is strange because they're asking me about some proofs, but they're not asking proofs from the Russians then. They're just leave them as Russians because they believe them, because they have this great Russian culture. And the thing is, why they actually have this great Russian culture? Because they spend a lot of money for cultural propaganda. They spend a lot of money for translations, for these exhibitions abroad, like with Ilya Repin and Malevich and other artists. They were promoting their so-called culture, but a lot of these artists were actually stolen, from Ukraine or Belarus. Not a lot of people know actually that Marc Chagall, he's from Belarus, not from Russia.
I was about to say as well, yeah, Marc Chagall, and he's still listed on Wikipedia, I just checked, as a Russian artist, even now on Wikipedia. Well, Oksana, I mean, this is a conversation which I'd love to have a continuation of, because clearly your work is ongoing, and it'd be great to regroup, find out how successful your efforts have been. But it's a huge pleasure speaking to you. Again, we're going to try to get as many of the images and artists you've mentioned as possible into the description of the video, and we'll see if we can bring a few of them up and integrate them into the video itself. But I'm glad you're safe and doing amazing work. Thank you so much for your time, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you. Heroyam Slava.